The suspense was too great, so I have to keep going. So we're going to start the second chapter, Digory and His Uncle, and I'm just going to read half the chapter, because I have to know what happened to Polly. She disappeared. It was so sudden, and so horribly unlike anything that had ever happened to Digory, even in a nightmare, that he let out a scream, and instantly Uncle Andrew's hand was over his mouth. "None of that," he hissed in Digory's ear. "If you start making a noise, your mother'll hear it, and you know what a fright might do to her." And as Digory said afterward, the horrible meanness of getting at a chap in that way almost made him sick. But of course he didn't scream again. "That's better," said Uncle Andrew, "and perhaps you couldn't help it. It is a shock when you first see someone vanish. Why, it gave me a turn when the guinea pig did it the other night." "Was that when you yelled?" asked Digory. "Oh, you heard that, did you? I hope you haven't been spying on me." "No, I haven't," said Digory indignantly. "But what happened to Polly?" "Well, congratulate me, my dear boy," said Uncle Andrew, rubbing his hands. "My experiment has succeeded. The little girl is gone, vanished, right out of the world." "What have you done to her?" "Sent her, well, to another place." "What do you mean?" asked Digory. Uncle Andrew sat down and said, "Well, I'll tell you about it. Have you ever heard of old Mrs. NEPHEW?" "Wasn't she a great aunt or something?" said Digory. "Not exactly," said Uncle Andrew. "She was my godmother. That's her, there, on the wall." And Digory looked and saw a faded photograph. It showed the face of an old woman in a bonnet. And he could now remember that he had once seen a photo of the same face in an old drawer at home in the country. He had asked his mother who it was, and Mother had not seemed to want to talk about the subject much. It was not at all a nice face, Digory thought. And he thought, of course, with those early photographs, one could really never tell. "Well, there was something wrong about her, Uncle Andrew," he said. "Well," said Uncle Andrew with a chuckle, "it depends on what you call wrong. People are so narrow-minded. She certainly got very queer in later life, did very unwise things. That was why they shut her up." "In an asylum, you mean?" "Oh, no, no, no," said Uncle Andrew in a shocked voice. "Nothing of the sort. Only in prison." "I say," said Digory, "well, what had she done?" "Ah, the poor woman," said Uncle Andrew. "She had been very unwise. There were a good many different things. We needn't go into it all right now. But she was always very kind to me. But look here, what has that got to do with Polly? I wish you would—" "All in good time, my boy," said Uncle Andrew. "They let old Mrs. Leafy out before she died, and I was one of the very few people whom she would allow to see her in her last illness. And she had got to dislike ordinary, ignorant people, you understand. I do myself. But she and I were interested in the same sort of things. It was only a few days before her death that she told me to go to an old bureau in her house and open a secret drawer and bring her a little box that I would find there. The moment I picked up that box, I could tell by the pricking in my fingers that I held some great secret in my hands. She gave it me and made a promise that as soon as she was dead, I would burn it, unopened, with certain ceremonies. That promise I did not keep." "Well, then, it was jolly rotten of you," said Digory. "Rotten?" said Uncle Andrew, with a puzzled look. "Oh, I see. You mean that little boys ought to keep their promises. Very true, most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you have been taught to do it. But of course you must understand that the rules of that sort however excellent they may be for little boys and servants and women and even to people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. So it looks like the uncle got his hands on a little bit of black magic. And that's where all of this is coming from. No, Digory, men like me, who possess hidden wisdom, are freed from common rules, just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. Sounds like Gnosticism. As he said this, he sighed and looked so grave and noble and mysterious that for a second Digory really thought he was saying something rather fine. But then he remembered the ugly look he had seen on the uncle's face, and that the moment before Polly had vanished. And all at once, he saw through Uncle Andrew's grand words. All it means, he said to himself, is that he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. Of course, said Uncle Andrew, I didn't dare to open the box for a long time, for I knew it might contain something highly dangerous. For my grandmother was a very remarkable woman. The truth is, she was one of the last mortals in this country who had fairy blood in her. She said there had been two others in her time. One was a duchess and the other was a charwoman. In fact, Digory, you are now talking to the last man, possibly, who really had a fairy godmother. There! That'll be something for you to remember when you're an old man yourself. Well, I bet she was a bad fairy, thought Digory, and added out loud. But what about Polly? How you do harp on that, said Uncle Andrew. As if that was what mattered. My first task was, of course, to study the box itself. It was very ancient. And I knew enough even then to know it wasn't Greek or Old Egyptian or Babylonian or Hittite or Chinese. It was older than any of those nations. And that was a great day when I at last found out the truth. The box was Atlantean. It came from the lost island of Atlantis. That meant it was centuries older than any of the Stone Age things they dig up in Europe. And it wasn't a rough, crude thing like them either. For in the very dawn of time, Atlantis was already a great city with palaces and temples and learned men. He paused for a moment as if he expected Digory to say something, but Digory was disliking his uncle more every minute, so he said nothing. Meanwhile, continued Uncle Andrew, I was learning a good deal in other ways, and it wouldn't be proper to explain them to a child, about magic in general. That meant that I came to have a fair idea of what sort of things might be in the box. By various tests, I narrowed down the possibilities. I had to get to know some devilish queer people and go through some very disagreeable experiences. That was what turned my head gray. And one doesn't become a magician for nothing. My health broke down in the end, but I got better. And at last I actually knew. Although there was not really the least chance of anyone overhearing them, he leaned forward and almost whispered as he said, the Atlantean box contained something that had been brought from another world when our world was only just beginning. What? Said Digory, who was now interested in spite of himself. Only dust, said Uncle Andrew. Fine, dry dust. Nothing much to look at. Not much to show for a lifetime of toil, you might say. Oh, but when I looked at the dust, I took jolly good care not to touch it, and thought that every grain had once been in another world. I don't mean another planet, you know. They're part of our world, and you could get to them if you went far enough. But a really other world, another nature, another universe, somewhere you would never reach even if you traveled through space of this universe forever and ever. A world that could be reached only by magic. Well, here Uncle Andrew rubbed his hands till his knuckles cracked like fireworks. I knew, he went on, that if only you can get it into the right form, that dust would draw you back to the place it had come from. And that's where we're going to pause. But the last sentence. But the difficulty was to get it into the right form. My earlier experiments were all failures. I tried them on guinea pigs, and some of them only died, and some exploded like little bombs. So we'll pause there as half the chapter.